Amid the unending upheavals within the British royal family, as King Charles III grows increasingly frail after a serious illness, and Prince William struggles under the weight of leading a post-Brexit and deeply uncertain United Kingdom, the eyes of the nation and the world have begun to turn toward a small figure shouldering an enormous destiny, Prince George. At the age of 11, he is not only the eldest son of Prince William and Princess Catherine, but also second in line to the throne, a living symbol of the future of a monarchy that has stood for over 1,000 years. George is not like other children. He grows up in castles, studies at meticulously selected schools, and has met heads of state before he even learned the full alphabet. Yet in those quiet blue eyes, one can still glimpse something profoundly unique, a boy who knows he is different, but who has yet to understand why that difference is bound to the fate of an entire empire. The future of the British monarchy may never look the same again. The times are changing, faith in the crown is being tested, and the new generation no longer bows blindly to royalty. In this context, Prince George stands as the most fragile yet formidable hope, a symbol still growing, embodying the delicate fusion of tradition and the yearning for renewal. And one day when he ascends the throne, will George be the one to save the monarchy or the last to witness its silent collapse? At Westminster Abbey, the historic site of so many grand coronations of English monarchs that day, was radiant with light, echoing with hymns and filled with a suffocating solemnity. King Charles III, draped in a crimson robe and bearing the St. Edward's crown weighing more than 2 kilograms, walked between rows of clergy and royal dignitaries with the rigid posture of a man who had waited his entire life to touch the throne. But no matter how flawless the ceremony, what moved the world was not the moment he wore the crown, but a whisper brief, faint that rose above the chiming bells, and the thousands of eyes watching a whisper meant for Prince George. George, then only 9 years old, wore a purple-red robe once worn by his grandfather during a coronation decades ago. As one of the 4 pages of honor, he stood in a special position, right behind the king. His small frame was swallowed by the powerful men surrounding him, but George's blue eyes still gleamed under the candlelight of the abbey. Every gesture of the young boy was broadcast live to hundreds of millions of viewers. Yet no one expected the most precious moment to occur in near-complete silence. As Charles turned and bent close to his grandson's ear, his lips clearly formed a few words. No audio was recorded, but enough to make George tremble. A flicker of confusion flashed across the boy's face, and then suddenly, boom, George raised his hand to wipe away a tear streaming down his cheek. A real tear. No script, no stage, and just like that, amid the dazzling symbolism of it all, the public remembered only one fleeting moment, the tear of a prince who had never been crowned. Immediately, but social media exploded. The hashtag Tear of Destiny began trending within just 10 minutes. A 7-second clip of George wiping his tear was shared at lightning speed. Speculation surged about Charles's whisper. Was it "I'm proud of you" or "one day, this will be yours"? Some even believed Charles said, "Be strong, for the crown never forgives." Whatever the words were to the millions watching, that tear was not merely emotional, it was inheritance. An invisible ritual, more sacred than any crown. But another wave rose alongside it, a wave of reflection. Older generations, who had once seen Diana pushed out of the palace, couldn't help but feel a tightness in their chest watching George in that role. They recalled the image of young William and Harry walking behind their mother's coffin, silent and forced. And now, it was George's turn, the third-generation child caught in the same royal whirlwind, expected to be strong before he could even understand the meaning of bowing before a crowd. That tear, in a strange way, made Charles's coronation feel more like a farewell than a beginning. For many of them, it was not just a moment of transition between 2 generations, but a final goodbye to the past. In it, the atmosphere of the church seemed to carry with it memories of Queen Elizabeth II, the great-grandmother who had been with the people for 70 years, and the faint but haunting image of Princess Diana. That is why Charles's whisper was no longer just a grandfather speaking to his grandson, but a king passing on something he himself had never truly held in full, the public's trust. George, with just one tear, became a symbol of the future, not because he represented power, but because he represented humanity within royalty, a rare quality, and one easily crushed under the weight of tradition. And perhaps, in that very moment, George also felt the terrible burden that crown carries, not just gold and jewels, but pressure, loneliness, and the sacrifice of childhood to become an ideal. After the ceremony, analyses flooded in. Some newspapers called that tear the beginning of the George era. Some experts saw it as a sign of the conflict between duty and emotion, something the House of Windsor has always tried to hide beneath a veneer of composure and pride. But no one denied one thing from that moment on. George was no longer just an ordinary child. He had crossed the threshold of destiny, with a distant gaze and a tear falling in the midst of royal grandeur. That coronation did not just mark the accession of King Charles III, it opened a new chapter for Prince George, the future heir, a chapter that perhaps even he was not yet ready to read. But history does not wait for anyone to be ready. It only chooses the moment, and that tear was destined to be the first line. As a page of honor, George was not simply the boy holding the robe, assisting his grandfather in the ceremony. The robe he wore that day was a piece of history once worn by Charles at his own investiture decades earlier, and before that by previous kings of the Windsor line. The robe was heavy, not just because of its velvet and gold thread, but because it carried the weight of a dynasty, of centuries of tradition, of the pressures that anyone born into royal blood cannot escape. And George, though only 9 years old, had to learn to stand straight with that burden on his shoulders. Before stepping out in front of millions of people watching the coronation, George had gone through weeks of training in the ancient corridors of the palace. Every step, every bow, every ceremonial smile had to be perfect. Tutors, aides, and Charles's attendants took turns refining him, not to make him a child well-versed in etiquette, but to ensure George would not make a mistake. Because in the eyes of the public, a slip, a misplaced glance could become an excuse for gossip, mockery, or doubts about his future as king. In the midst of that training, no one knows whether George ever cried alone in his room or asked his parents, "Can I choose another path?" But one thing is certain: when Charles bent down and whispered something into George's ear during the ceremony, it was not just a simple encouragement. It was a passing of the crown, a sacred ritual, unwritten in books, carried out only through a glance, a soft voice, and a falling tear. Theories quickly spread afterward. You will not be alone. Keep your heart. One day this will be yours. Whatever the words were, Charles had passed on a part of the crown, not in material form, but in emotion, in the acceptance that it was time for George to carry the mission. And George, like every royal child destined for the throne, does not have the right to refuse. He was born on July 22, 2013, and from that very moment, the entire United Kingdom called him the future king. From his name to where he studied, the people he played with, the way he ate, the way he smiled, everything fell under the lens. He is not free to choose his friends, not allowed to cry in public, not permitted to make childhood mistakes, because every step George takes is part of a long-term plan called monarchy stabilization. Charles's coronation was the day he officially entered history as king, but for George, it was the day he stepped out of the world of a normal child. Standing inside Westminster Abbey, candlelight dancing across his still young face, George was not merely a witness to a 1,000-year-old ceremony. He was a living testament to the continuity of power, a quiet yet binding transfer of reign. George's tear became a symbol, not because it was moving, but because it was real. It spoke of a child's helplessness in the face of a fate already written. It was living proof that even if you are born in a palace, educated at prestigious schools, and known by the entire world, you can still feel lost. And in that moment, He was no longer Prince George. He was just a child, standing in a grand cathedral, with the whole world watching to see who he would become. Many looked at that scene and felt proud. They said, "The boy is brave." But others felt heartache. They whispered, "Has anyone ever asked George what he wants?" But in a monarchy, personal emotions are never the focus. Tears are not recorded in royal archives. Only perfect images, resilient messages, and pre-written speeches are remembered. And after all is said and done, George will grow up with the truth he is the only one not allowed to fall, because when Charles is no longer here, William will succeed. And after William, it will be him. The throne does not permit delay. There is no such thing as asking for rest. It demands lifelong service. And George began that journey with a silent tear right at his grandfather's coronation. And that is what makes George's story different. He did not get to choose his destiny, but he accepted it not with grand speeches, but with genuine emotion. And it is exactly that which gives people a hope that one day, when the crown passes from Charles to William, then to George, the United Kingdom will not just have a king, but a real human being, someone who once knew how to cry and still dares to carry an entire monarchy on his small shoulders. Amid the solemn bells and flickering candlelight of the coronation, Catherine's hand grasping George's was not just a mother's instinctive gesture. It was a deeply emotional continuation of a sacred promise, the very promise Princess Diana once whispered to her sons 3 decades ago. "If I am no longer here, I want you to never feel alone." In the moment George shed his tear, Catherine did what Diana had always done throughout a life torn apart by the crown and its expectations. She stood between her child and the cold stares of the palace. Diana was once forced to live in a gilded cage, but despite being trapped by duty and betrayed by the man she once shared a bed with, she always fought tirelessly to protect her 2 sons. In public photographs, Diana appeared radiant, but behind the scenes was a mother who often knelt down, held William and Harry tightly in the cold palace corridors, and whispered, "I won't let anyone hurt you." She openly defied tradition, refused to send her sons to boarding school too early, and insisted on bringing them on royal tours so they would not grow up in loneliness. And now Catherine is continuing that silent vow. As George begins to understand that he is not allowed to live like other children, Catherine quietly sets boundaries with the media, refuses many photo requests, and personally intervenes in the editing of articles about her son. In the age of social media, she understands that just one mistake could have George's childhood devoured by sensational headlines. And she will not let that happen. She teaches George that being a prince does not mean losing his innocence, that he can wear a robe at the coronation, but afterwards still has the right to take it off and run with his sister Charlotte and brother Louis in the gardens of Kensington Palace. There is a little-known story when George was only 3 years old. A major British newspaper proposed an exclusive photo shoot to celebrate his birthday. The fee offered was almost impossible to refuse. But Catherine said just one sentence: "My son is not a commercial symbol of the royal family." She flatly refused. She did not want George to become a victim of public curiosity the way her husband's mother once was. Catherine does not speak to the public like Diana, nor does she shake the media with explosive interviews. But she quietly protects her child with a cold, unwavering determination. In internal meetings with the royal family's advisory board, Catherine once stated clearly, "George is not a tool to restore the royal image. He is a child." That statement made some uncomfortable. But she didn't care, because the only thing she cares about is that George's eyes will never have to view life through the fear that Harry once carried throughout his youth. That is why Catherine's grip on George's hand at Westminster was not a random gesture. It was a reawakening of a promise, as if Diana had passed on an invisible thread to the daughter-in-law she never met, but perhaps had chosen from somewhere beyond this world. Catherine, quiet, steady, never impulsive, is the one fulfilling Diana's unfinished mission to turn a cold throne into a place that can protect little hearts, even when the entire world wants to crush them. And if one day George wears the crown once worn by his grandfather, people will remember the day of the coronation when the wine wiped away a tear and his mother's hand gripped his. They will remember the look in Catherine's eyes, not those of a princess, but of a mother, brave and unyielding, who stood between her son and the shadow of royal power, just like Diana once did. And this time, history does not repeat itself. It is rewritten by a mother's love. Under the dim golden light of Westminster Abbey, as William knelt before King Charles III and pledged his loyalty, people saw in him not only a crown prince, but a man carrying the weight of two generations on his shoulders. It was not just an oath to his father, an aging king who had just placed upon his head the ancient crown, but also a silent commitment to his late mother, Princess Diana. And deep in those resilient yet burdened eyes was the shadow of another child, standing behind him in a royal robe, trying not to tremble before a fate already determined, Prince George. William knows all too well the path George is about to enter, for he has walked it himself, torn between duty and dreams, forced to smile before millions of cameras while his heart had not yet healed from early losses. He has never forgotten the fateful morning of September 6, 1997, when he and his brother Harry walked behind Diana's casket amidst endless lines of weeping citizens. William was only 15 then and aged forever in that moment. And since then, he has carried within him a promise never spoken aloud that if he had children, he would not let them grow up in the shadow of media scrutiny and royal secrets as he once had to. That is why, when he saw George quietly wipe away a tear after King Charles's whispered words, William's heart clenched. He couldn't help but think of stories repeating themselves like a cruel cycle of destiny. William knows well time does not stand still for royalty. The moment has come to discuss separating George from his current carefree closeness in order to prepare him for a role he cannot refuse. And one of the signs approaching is a long-standing royal rule being mentioned after the age of 12. An heir to the throne is no longer permitted to fly on the same plane as the reigning monarch, to ensure the line of succession is preserved in the event of an accident. To William, that rule is not just a formality. It is a cruel reminder that his son, the same boy who not long ago chased toy horses, is about to be pulled into the massive machinery of the monarchy. And that is why William and Catherine have quietly begun discussing a new strategy, minimizing George's public appearances as much as possible. No more official event attendances, no more smiling prince in front of the camera photos instead, days of ordinary schooling, outings without bodyguards, evenings spent playing Lego rather than practicing proper bows. And William understands that a future king does not only need to learn how to deliver speeches, but also needs to live as a child before having to become an adult. He lost his own childhood in the flash of camera lights, in sensational headlines and press conferences full of lies. And he swore he would not let that happen again with George. One night, not long before the coronation, William sat beside his son's bed and told him about Diana, not with flowery words or political tales. He spoke of a grandmother who liked listening to Elton John, who made sandwiches with her sons on Sunday mornings, who laughed loudly whenever William said something silly. George asked, "Why isn't Grandma here?" Dad William didn't answer right away. He simply hugged his son, because there are questions even an heir to the throne cannot answer. But that very moment, the silence between two generations became a pact. William knew then that he was not just the bridge between two reigns. He was the shield between George and the towering shadow of royalty. He was the one who had to preserve George's gentle heart in a world where hearts have turned to stone. And then the coronation happened. George, wearing a robe heavier than his childhood, performed his role as page of honor flawlessly. But for William, his son's gaze during the ceremony wasn't one of pride. It was a look searching for safety, an unspoken cry for help. "Dad, can I really do this?" And William, as he knelt before his father, wasn't only pledging loyalty to King Charles, he was pledging to himself that he would use all his remaining strength to protect his son from the approaching storm. Because William knows one thing: the crown is not a reward. It is a velvet-covered cage. And the only one who can unlock that cage is a father who knows how to love, who knows when to say no to tradition, and who dares to choose heart over heraldry. People still call William the firm's golden boy, the obedient son of the monarchy. But behind that aura is a man who once stood in the ruins and built himself a flawless shell. Now, as that shell begins to crack under George's innocent eyes, William knows he must learn to do what Charles never did for him: to listen, to protect, and to be ready to defy the system if that system threatens his child's happiness. If one day George ascends the throne, people will trace it back to that ceremony when the boy wiped away a tear and William knelt. For that was the day a new generation began. Not just a transfer from father to son, but between two mindsets: a monarchy rooted in rule and a future rooted in love. And if the British royal family endures another century, perhaps it will be because of that. Not power, not tradition, but a father, once an orphan child himself, who dared to choose love as the compass for the crown. Far from the dazzling lights of the coronation, when Westminster Abbey becomes just a silent photograph hanging on the palace wall, Prince George returns to the reality of being a 10-year-old boy living in the gilded cage called royalty. But that gilded cage is not as sparkling as many imagine. It is heavy with tradition, with expectations, and with whispered instructions, not just once, but repeated every day, over breakfast with his father, lessons with tutors, and even in the silent gaze from his grandfather Charles. George is being trained, in the literal sense, for a role fate assigned him the moment he was born. Not swordsmanship or horse riding like ancient kings, but learning to smile for cameras without showing fatigue, learning to shake hands with world leaders without trembling, and learning to keep his emotions to himself, because a future king is not allowed to weep in public. But amid those swirling expectations, there is something that sets George apart. He is not growing up in solitude as his father once did. At his side is his sister Charlotte, a little princess with astonishingly sharp eyes, who once earned media praise for controlling a crowd with a glance at the Queen's funeral. Charlotte is not just a sister, but is gradually becoming George's heartkeeper. She knows when her brother is anxious, when he wants silence, and when he needs a playful quip to pull him out of pressure. Some call Charlotte the new generation Anne, drawing a comparison with Princess Anne, the loyal sister of King Charles, who said openly what the royals did not dare speak. And in George, a part of Charles seems to be reborn. But this time, his grandfather does not want to repeat mistakes. Charles, in his old age and having weathered life's highs and lows, understands better than anyone what it feels like to be swallowed by ceremony and tradition. Therefore, though not outwardly emotional, Charles quietly watches George, conveying messages through his eyes and through short, penetrating words like fine blades. The whisper at the coronation was not a random moment. It was the opening chapter for hundreds of whispers yet to come. One rainy afternoon at Sandringham, where William's family had retreated after a series of public events, George was allowed to play football with classmates on the West Lawn. The game lasted only 20 minutes, watched over by 3 bodyguards and 2 royal aides. But when a friend accidentally knocked George to the ground, instead of getting angry or crying, he simply smiled, got up, and said, "I'm not king. Not yet." "Keep playing," the words reached William's ears, rendering him speechless, because he knew that in these ordinary moments, George was teaching himself how to step into his lifelong role, something nobody can teach. William and Catherine know better than anyone that George is walking a tightrope between childhood and the throne. They have had silent debates in their private quarters at Adelaide Cottage about whether to send George to boarding school, as tradition dictates, or choose a freer environment. William, molded by the pressures of Eton, has not forgotten the lonely nights spent questioning, "Am I living my own life?" And now he does not want his son to repeat that path. "We need to let the boy breathe," Catherine once said, her voice firm but full of love. Since then, George has taken violin lessons, art classes, and even chemistry not to become a good king, but to grow into a real person with genuine feelings and interests. Charlotte has also been encouraged to do things few expect a princess to do: bake cookies, learn drumming, and look after her brother when he feels overwhelmed. George may not realize it, but everyone around him is bearing invisible burdens. Charles endures by memory, William by childhood scars, Catherine by the heart of a mother, and Charlotte with a strange empathy, as if inside that 9-year-old girl sleeps a queen yet to awaken. The British monarchy is changing, but that change does not come from grand speeches or formal reform. It comes from George's gaze as he observes the world, from Charlotte's gentle smile as she leads her brother away from a long meeting, from William's silent determination to shield his son from the media, and from Catherine's quiet kindness beneath her stern exterior, refusing to place royal duty above motherly happiness. George is not a typical child, but he is being raised by a family doing everything possible to give him the most normal life they can. And that is what makes him a symbol, not only of the throne, but of a Briton learning to cherish what is truly human. One day George will wear the crown. But today he is just a boy playing football in the rain, grinning and waving at a squirrel crossing the lawn. And perhaps, in that moment, Britain will glimpse the future, not the gleaming crown, but the genuine heart beneath the red robe, the heart of a king in the making, in silence, yet filled with hope. Beneath the heavy red robe and the seemingly cold royal rules, Prince George emerges not only as a boy groomed to be king, but as an emblem of a new era. Not a stiff model of royalty, but a blend of courage and compassion, of discipline and empathy. In his eyes, sometimes shy, sometimes steel, people see what many monarchs of the past lost: a heart that still feels amidst countless expectations. George doesn't speak much, but every small act, from holding his mother's hand at the coronation, to wiping away his tears after his grandfather's whisper, to yielding the spotlight to his sister before the camera reveals one thing: he is discovering who he is, and his future is calling him in a way no one can evade. Under pressure that would make adults falter, George remains composed. And that, above all, is the sign of a king-to-be, not because he shouts his strength, but because he is learning to stand firm in silence. So the question remains, is George fit to become king in the future? For me, the answer is a resounding yes. Not only fit, but essential. Because after all Britain has been through, perhaps what they need most now is a king who knows how to listen, to empathize, and to grow in light as well as in darkness. And George, in his own unique way, is walking steadily toward that. If your heart, too, is moved by Prince George's tears, by royal secrets, and by the maturation journey of a future king, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so we can continue uncovering untold stories behind the British crown. Every follow fuels us to bring deeper, more heartfelt perspectives. Let's journey together, because behind the throne, there are always truths waiting to be revealed.